Hey guys, what's up? Now's about the time where, like anyone, I admit that I'm a human and that not everything I've said in my videos so far was exactly correct. Don't get me wrong, I try to do everything correctly, but it doesn't always translate into reality. I got this idea from Zidnaf, another YouTuber who did a video like this explaining stuff that he'd gotten wrong in his videos. My logic, at least, is that I feel like I'd be doing a disservice to y'all by giving y'all faulty information and letting y'all believe it any longer. So, what I'm mainly focused on addressing here is any mistakes I made regarding the educational content of my past videos, or misuse of vocabulary, or stuff that I wasn't necessarily wrong about but just could have explained better. I'm not going to try addressing typos, as they're just facts of life, or mistakes I made in the language that I was speaking in because it has nothing to do with what I was teaching. I also won't correct my past IPA because if I did, this video would be 2 weeks long. So, let's watch me embarrass myself by updating y'all on stuff that I've already talked about. If you're looking for corrections on a specific video, the starting time coordinates for each are on the screen now. First up, from all the way back in 2017, we have Why is English so hard to spell? I hadn't quite figured out how to format my screen or do audio yet, so sorry about the low quality there. Anyway.
But how they work in English is that all unstressed vowels get reduced to except for E and O phonemes when they're the last vowel in a word.
My first error, which I have corrected in my more recent videos, is here. This is somewhat of a textbook definition of English reduction, but nowadays, especially among American English speakers my age, vowels are reduced either to that or I. I haven't quite figured out the system to determine which one is said, but chances are that there are many systems for different dialects and ages. If you know any system, drop it in the comments.
For example, Swedish has 9 vowels and modified the Latin script to have 9 vowel characters.
So actually, this is debatable. Swedish has vowel length distinctions, so most people actually say that Swedish has 17 vowels, but it's still up in the air. I personally see vowel length as a super segmental feature, so I'm in the 9 camp.
This is some English BS where a long vowel is said like its own name and a short vowel is said some other way.
I've addressed this more recently as well, but basically it's not for no reason that English orthography has vowel length distinction while English speech doesn't. It's actually for historical reasons. I went in depth about this in the language overview of English.
We could always invent a new alphabet tailored to fit English by having 12 to 14 vowel characters with 23 consonant characters to represent the consonants that English has.
I got the count wrong. English has 36 phonemes, not counting allophones. I think I accidentally counted an allophone here. If you're interested in learning more about this, I'd recommend the Lang Focus video on the same subject. He especially elaborates on the historical aspect of this whole mess. Cool, now let's move into 2018 and the language overview on Hebrew. I actually feel like I made a lot of mistakes here, and I'll probably re-upload it sometime in the future to rectify that, although most of what I said was still true.
After that, the Israelites went into exile in various parts of the world and linguistically assimilated into their regions, resulting in Hebrew dying out as a native language.
The thing is, not all Jews left Israel. The Jews were just banned from Yerushalayim, but Tiberias, for example, was still a significant Jewish hub. Also, it's somewhat disagreed if Biblical Hebrew was made extinct by the Romans or by the Babylonians, who did the same thing to the Jews in 587 BC before Cyrus the Great let us back into Israel in 539 BC because he was the GOAT. The main evidence for the Roman theory, in my opinion, is the fact that the Jews were only enslaved in Babylon for 48 years, while the main evidence for the Babylonian theory is the legal status of Aramaic afterwards, implying that that was a more well-known language to the Jews. There's also a theory that it gradually phased out over this time period.
There's not even a hard glottal stop or vowel changing power like Ayin has, it's just there, inaudible. To demonstrate, some words with Aleph are Emet Kev, Deshe, Leroz, Limtzo, and Ivud.
I made 2 minor mistakes in this segment. The first one was that I called the sound represented by Ayin a glottal stop. It's actually a pharyngeal stop, sometimes called an epiglottal stop, depending on who you ask, although in casual speech it's just ignored. Also in this segment, the word for las is ibud, with a b, as that particular template takes the plosive versions of the allophones I'd mentioned earlier in the video.
Modifiers almost always come after their nouns, namely adjectives, but not numbers.
The statement that numbers in Hebrew come before their nouns is, for the most part, correct. However, there's an exception. The number 1, echad or achat, goes after the noun.
But if one tried pluralizing the number, it would come out achutza ola shishot shkalim, or the shirt costs 60 shekels.
It should be shishim shekel, as numbers in Hebrew actually stop agreeing with gender past 19. Therefore, 60 is shishim, regardless if it's modifying a masculine or feminine noun. Also shekel, because nouns with numbers stop being pluralized between 30 and 99.
It's used whenever the word the would be used in English and doesn't change for gender or number.
Here, I forgot to mention that, in fact, the adjectives of definite nouns are also marked with has, so it was a mistake to say that it's used in the same way as in English.
Hebrew nouns are split into 2 genders, masculine and feminine, and 2 numbers, singular and plural.
This is mostly true. However, Hebrew's ancestors did have a dual number used when there's exactly 2 of something. The morpheme is pretty easy, just add aim to the end of the noun, add the tav for those particular feminine nouns if needed. It didn't survive into modern Hebrew, but left some traces. Specifically, words related to periods of time still get inflected for dual, like shatayim, yomayim, shvuayim, chodshayim, and shnatayim, and the dual is now the designated plural form for certain nouns that tend to come in pairs like einayim, oznaim, yadayim, sfatayim, na'alayim, raglayim, and for some reason shinayim, even though last I checked, teeth typically come in groups a bit larger than 2.
There is no widespread use of noun cases, although certain directions use the dative case to distinguish them from their prepositional counterparts.
I definitely gave this biblical Hebrew case the wrong name. Dative is used for cases that indicate specifically indirect object, not direction or destination. I've seen an article that called it an accusative case, but that's also wrong, as that's explicitly represented in Hebrew by the etz preposition, and it appears that the writer of that article was going off of the purely Indo-European concept that destinations of verbs of motion are represented with accusative case. Since the biblical Hebrew case we're talking about here specifically refers to direction or destination, I'd say it's an allative case.
2 of the endings change when a noun is supplemental to another noun, that is, when the noun, often a verb's gerund, is kind of acting as an adjective.
Here I use some imprecise vocabulary, although I did show it on screen. The name for what I was calling supplemental nouns is the construct state, or construct case. Whether it's a case or not is debated, but that whole debate is something I'll definitely cover in its own future video. The construct case is actually somewhat interesting for linguists as it's an inflection that comes where a genitive case would normally be, but on the main noun instead of the genitive, or supplemental, noun.
Hebrew verbs are very systematic, and there are only 5 common irregulars.
Yeah, here I massively underscored the variations of Hebrew verbs. While it's true that Hebrew verbs are far more regular than Indo-European verbs, there are different ways that people think about irregular verbs. For example, I will eventually go on to talk about verbs with their first root disappearing as though they're regular verbs. However, almost everyone disagrees with that and says that verbs like that are irregular, and by now I agree with them. Also, remember adjectives in the sameach construction? They have infinitive verb forms that are identical to that of present tense verbs like moshech. The verb be happy in the infinitive is lismoach. This means that you could technically call that particular type of verb an irregular verb. In addition, when talking about the 5 irregulars, I just straight up gave the wrong word for the infinitive of can. It's not lichol, it's luchal. Super irregular there. Also just below it, tzarich, need, doesn't have an infinitive form as it's not a verb at all. It's purely an adjective and behaves as such. Also, since we're getting into verbs, I was kinda wild on the binyanim, saying there were like 13 of them. Most people who try to organize this stuff say that there are 7 of them, and they don't differentiate the verbs by number of root letters.
If one of the last 2 root letters is one of these,
here I incorrectly manifested what I knew about the verb lechol. In Hebrew, I will eat is ochal, so I assumed that the lack of vav was due to the kaf. However, that's not why. It's actually because of the first root letter being aleph. When that happens, the future tense follows that specific pattern, but with o being the first vowel. About half of the time. We can actually probably follow this under irregulars as well.
litkonen is mechuvan.
Completely wrong. The past participle of litkonen is mochan, while mechuvan is the past participle of litkaven, a completely different verb. That was just some idiocy on my part.
And kshafti means when I was flying or when I flew.
I used the less than optimal word for fly there. La'uf means fly, like when you fly yourself just out in the open or like a bird flies. I should have said kshtasti because latus is used for flying while actually sitting on a plane.
אני מושן שנתתם להרבה מידע לחטוא לכם המוחים.
The word is machot, it's one of the irregulars. I find it annoying and funny how I discussed irregular plural nouns extensively earlier in the video and still messed one up in the outro. I also made the entry of the knowledge sound aggressive, but that's all good. Also, throughout the video, I made a few errors with pronunciation, so lazkir has a k sound, not a ch sound. The masculine singular past of ledaber is diber with e, not a, and I occasionally put the stress on the wrong syllable. Like I said, I'll probably re-upload that sometime. It shouldn't take too long since I don't have to change too much of what I said. The next video is the one where I explain IPA. First off, about the whole video, I use some really awkward IPA that isn't even widely accepted, so I'd say the video is still good to learn about the system, but go to my more recent videos if you want to see better written IPA, especially in English. For example, instead of using a syllabic consonant bar under a syllabic consonant, I would use a weird vowel character, and I wouldn't represent long vowels very well.
A colon after it means that the speaker's lips close over the duration of the sound.
2 wrong parts here. It's not a normal colon, it's a colon made of miniature triangles. Also, they don't indicate a closing vowel. For that, you'd have to use an additional vowel, in this case oo with an inverted breve below it. The triangular colon indicates a long vowel or geminated consonant.
And this apostrophe-looking thing that goes to the upper left side of the vowel indicates wherein the word the stress is, while it's found on the lower left side of vowels with secondary stress.
Actually, the emphasis bars go before the entire stressed syllable, not just the vowel. I corrected this in more recent videos.
The difference is that in narrow transcription, with the brackets, you have to use the exact symbol for every phoneme regardless of whether native speakers differentiate between that phoneme and a similar one, while in broad transcription, with the slashes, symbols can be used that represent how native speakers see the sound.
This isn't wrong, I just explained it badly. The key word I didn't say is allophones. In narrow transcriptions, all the characters used have to be the exact IPA characters for that sound, whereas in broad transcription, you can use the phoneme even if it's an allophone in that spot. You're also allowed to do stuff like writing the R right side up in languages like English. Also, I now like brackets better aesthetically.
L, the sound in American English, Russian, and Portuguese. Yes, it's different from le.
I actually find it somewhat hard to quantify the dark L's, but basically, the falsehood here is that the only one of them that's post-alveolar is the Russian one. Also, it turns out I've been mispronouncing the word alveolar my whole life. The sounds in English and Portuguese are velar.
Then behind that, there's the pharyngeal consonants, which I can't even understand how they work.
That was wrong, I'd already studied Arabic by that point, and Arabic has two pharyngeal consonants, the voiceless pharyngeal fricative ha and the voiced pharyngeal fricative ah. They can also be called epiglottal.
The last word of a consonant's trinomial nomenclature is its style.
The more widely accepted word is manner. Alright, now we go to the next video, what to do about French writing. As a huge relief, there's only one mistake in the whole video.
Phonetically, French has 12 non-nasal vowels and 4 nasal vowels, making 16 total vowels.
Okay, so it turns out that this was expired information. French spoken today only has 3 nasal vowels, as merged with Now we move on to the Spanish language overview, the first video from 2019.
It began to diverge from other dialects around the fall of the Roman Empire in 576 AD.
The Roman Empire actually fell in 476 AD, 100 years before I thought it did. I'm more than happy to now be aware of that fact.
If both the direct object and indirect object are on the same side of the verb, then the direct object is always closer to the verb.
This is almost always true, but there's one exception I forgot about. If both the objects are in the form of clitic pronouns that come after an infinitive or imperative verb, then the indirect object is closer to the verb. That wasn't too bad, so here's a video about what makes different languages easier or harder than each other.
This is especially the case with specialized vocabulary, which helps a lot if you need to reconstruct a word that you've never heard in the target language that could have a cognate form.
Okay, just a bit of negligence on my part. The word witch is Germanic. I guess I just wasn't paying attention when I did the graphic. That's all for that, so now let's get into the video about extraterrestrial languages, where I didn't find any falsehoods, so now it's English time entering 2020.
An intrusive consonant is one that speakers say in certain situations where it doesn't belong to either of the surrounding words.
This is slightly inaccurate, as words wasn't the best word to use there. To this point, the only languages I knew with intrusive consonants were those dialects of English with an intrusive R, and French with the intrusive T. However, I'm now studying Icelandic, which has an intrusive T that doesn't come between words, it comes inside of the words. A better definition for intrusive consonants would be that they're allophones which, rather than just being a transformed version of a sound already in the word or phrase, come out of thin air in their phonetic environments. Also, just extra, a more official word for intrusive is epenthetic, which can actually describe both consonants and vowels.
English has 4 of the main articles, 2 definite and 2 indefinite.
Here I was a bit conflicted because I need to explain allomorphs. Allophones are where sounds change based on their surroundings, like I've said. Allomorphs, on the other hand, are where a morpheme changes solely based on its phonetic surroundings. Due to the fact that almost everyone sees and an as 2 separate words, I felt like I had to say that the and the were also separate words. The number of English articles that I should have given is 2. Finally, we're at the most recent video, which aims to help with pronunciation.
Light means alveolar, le, and dark means velar, la, in this case.
I wasn't wrong, but I explained the trick to the L's badly. Technically, all of them are alveolar since that's where the tongue hits. However, the names I gave them are based off of where the pressure is in the mouth, specifically for the dark L's. Light L's are alveolar with no pressure elsewhere. The post-alveolar dark L has alveolar contact with pressure a bit behind it as well, and the velar dark L has alveolar contact with pressure at the velum.
I don't care if we're talking about the n sound, which is the most common cross-linguistic sound found in every language in existence today.
Making broad statements like that is always a bit risky based on how many languages aren't well documented. For instance, in the standard dialect of Rotokas, one of the 2 languages tied for the record of smallest phoneme inventory, there's allegedly no n, although the other dialect definitely does have it. Also, the phoneme appears to be evolving out of Samoan, merging with n, as that's what's happening there in casual speech. That's all the mistakes that I feel a need to address as outlined in the intro. I guess this can be used as a reference for the other videos. A regular video will be out shortly. Thanks for watching.